Okay, so let's get right into the topic of supply chain risk management. As supply chain professionals, we are all very focused on supporting our organizations around the ability to generate profit. And that's, supply chain has a very vital role in that, being able to get the product there at the right time at the lowest cost, and every time doing it exactly correctly, if you will. But what we've had is a double punch. We've had both the tariffs, which have been around for a long time, and COVID, which really started getting on all of our radar screens right at the end of February, the front part of March. And what we have found ourselves in is that we're not only worried about the generation of profit, but as supply chain professionals, we're also worried about the protection of profit. And the way we're going to talk about that today is we're going to focus on using specific financial information as it relates to both customers and products to be able to focus on strategies that allow us to thrive and not just survive. So let's get into that a little bit. There are a number of different tools that we all are aware of in the market that can be used for supply chain risk management. The one that gets a lot of attention are control towers or risk tracking or mapping systems. So control towers are obviously allowing us to see where products are, how things are moving, if we can anticipate a problem. And the mapping is basically where are our assets, our suppliers, our products, and other ways of being able to locate things that are important to us. There's also the tried and true technology associated with network design, inventory optimization, simulation, and these are prescriptive tools, often looking 2-3 years out. How can I actually add resiliency by redesigning my network? But today, we're going to talk about a new class of tools, and these are tools associated with profit analytics, where we're going to actually use detailed and specific analytical information to be smarter in how we're going to define strategies around supply chain risk. So here's a simple diagram of a supply chain, very familiar to all of us, I'm sure. We're sourcing products from China. We're going through different ways to get them into the country or whatever country we're serving. We're getting closer to the customer, and then we have the final last mile of delivery. Very straightforward. And what has happened, with COVID-19 and tariffs is that we've basically seen an unprecedented impact on a global basis. There isn't country or industry or a company that hasn't been impacted in some way, and certainly as individuals, we've been seriously impacted as well. The length of time, no one knows when COVID is going to be over, but it's obviously having an enormous economic impact, as has the tariffs since about 2018, when the last trade war this trade war actually started. So it's a very big deal and something that we need to be thinking about. Certainly not going to be the last disruption we face as a supply chain industry. So getting into that, let's actually go take a deeper dive into risk management and talk about how we might think about being more resilient. So there's a phrase that we're going to use throughout the presentation that says, one size does not fit all. And I'm sure you've used it. You've heard it probably 100 times. But do you know where that came from? Do you know who first coined that phrase? Might surprise you. Frank Zappa. Those are hard rock fans in the audience. You may know who Frank Zappa was some time back, but he actually first used that phrase, which we thought was kind of interesting. Okay, so one size does not fit all. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to use specific supply chain financial insights in order to be able to create differentiated strategies. So there's a disruption, and something has happened now that is causing a lot of pain in our supply chain operation. And what every company will do, of course, is they'll look at how they're going to actually respond and recover from that. So a reactive set of actions and strategies associated with being able to minimize the negative impact that disruption has had on the operation. That is certainly a very important part of supply chain risk management. But there's a second part, and the second part is around being proactive, where you're actually looking at ways to be able to add resiliency to your supply chain on things that you worry that could happen that could be absolutely devastating to your supply chain. So reactive and proactive, and certainly between the two, You want to have the learnings as you go through these responses to make your supply chain more and more resilient over time. So those are the two areas we're going to focus on, and how to create strategies that are both reactive and proactive to add resiliency to your operation. So what is the key operating assumption associated with running a supply chain? So my guess is that what you would say is that the things that you've set up, the agreements that you've reached with your 3PLs, with your carriers, with your suppliers, and with others, that you expect those to work, the way it was established. But as we all know, especially right now with COVID, that's not always the case. But let's talk through one story that kind of makes that whole point. You're in the flower business, and you grow flowers in Kenya. And if you've ever seen the operation at Schiphol in Amsterdam, you know that when flowers are flown in from different places, including Kenya, there's a very efficient cross-dock operation where the flowers are off of one plane and onto another in a matter of minutes. It's incredibly efficient and low cost. So you're using that operation, and everybody's happy. Your CFO is happy. You're meeting customer demand on time, minimal damage on the product. So everything is just going great. Here we go. We're going up from Kenya. We're going through Schiphol. We're going over to JFK. All things seem to be working just fine. But then all of a sudden, a volcano goes off. Kaboom. And what happens? There's no flights for over 2 weeks. And you basically have flowers sitting on the tarmac. So you're actually losing a lot of money. Now, is your CFO happy about that? Absolutely not. So what would you say, Richard, what are you talking about? How would you predict a volcano to go off? And how's that going to apply to supply chain risk management? Well, of course, you're not going to be able to predict a volcano going off. But what if we looked at it with a different lens? What if we said, we have 100% of all of our profit generated in the North American market traversing one lane? Would you, as a supply chain professional, worry about that? Of course you would. So what would be a logical alternative? Be able to create an alternative way to be able to move your flowers into the North American market, possibly through Miami. Might use it just a little bit, might cost just a little bit more, but you have an alternative way in case something happens of strike, whatever it might be, to that one lane that you're counting on for all of your profit. Now, when a volcano would go off or any other disruption, what would your competitors be doing if they hadn't thought about this in the same way? They'd be dialing for capacity, right? What you're going to be doing is you've already got the procedures established. You've already got the arrangements associated with your carriers. You know the protocols, and you're able to quickly respond in a way to continue to satisfy that demand. So this is a great, simple example of thinking about ways to be able to mitigate risk as it relates to servicing your customers' orders. Okay, so let's talk about measuring financial performance as it relates to the supply chain operation. My guess is that everyone on this call has, in their company, has a standard cost, and they have a gross margin associated with the actual operation. But I'm also thinking that each of you have very specific priorities associated with and probably tied to incentives on how you're actually thinking about costs associated with your supply chains. Let's expand on that a little bit. So going from gross margin to those specific measurements that some of you said you're doing, we're focusing on, for every product, the sourcing costs, the inbound transportation costs, tariffs, of course, the manufacturing or value-added services, interfacility costs, warehousing, outbound, and reverse logistics is part of that. So having all of those costs gives you an accurate and specific cost to serve for every SKU sold to every customer. If you do the same thing on the revenue side, looking at the net revenue that you are generating from that sale, you come up with the net landed profit associated with every product being sold to every customer. And that information is really important as you're trying to differentiate strategies associated with supply chain risk management. So another story. This is a $5.5 billion operation out of Chicago. They serve through wholesalers and distributors and direct to their customers, and they have 110,000 delivery locations associated with their operation. A large DC network, their own fleet. They have carriers, 3PLs, et cetera. So a very complex operation. But they wanted to really understand, out of 110,000 delivery locations, how many of those locations gave them 80% of their profit out of 110,000. The answer is less than 3%. 2,843 delivery locations gave them 80% of their profit. They were flabbergasted. So reduce complexity, absolutely. Being able to think about different service levels, absolutely. Treating customers in different ways, absolutely. But what was also very startling for them is that their customer that was number 11, their 11th best customer, as measured based on revenue, was actually very unprofitable. They had no idea. So having that kind of information to reduce costs and complexity, understanding the true financial performance of each customer, led to some very happy shareholder results. And this is not atypical of what we see within companies for their customers and their products. And the whole idea is to be able to have this information in a way that is accurate and trusted and repeatable, to be able to make strategies that are effective in managing the supply chain, including supply chain risk. So let's get into the two areas that we want to focus on with regard to reactive, which we talked about, and proactive. And let's start with reactive. So again, there's been some form of a disruption. You are now responsible to be on a team to be able to think about how we can minimize the negative impact of whatever this disruption has been. And you want to definitely stabilize the situation as quickly as you can in order to minimize the financial impact of the disruption. And I'm sure all of you have been involved with this with COVID for sure. Tariffs have been with us since, for a long time, but the current tariff war, trade war, really started to heat up in July of 2018. And it's still going on, as we all know. So what's really interesting about this, as far as reactive strategies, is that DHL did a survey of just under 300 companies at the end of 2019. And they basically asked, how many of you are creating strategies to address tariffs, to be able to be smartly handle these tariff increases? What was really surprising about the results is more than 1/3 of the companies, so almost 100 companies, saying they were not doing anything. They were just waiting for the problem to go away. And that's probably not a very good answer, what I would think. And so this is an issue that a lot of companies need to address. And now with COVID, we believe that any disruption, what's going to happen is shareholders and stakeholders are going to require supply chain executives to demonstrate what they are actually doing to be able to add resiliency to their supply chain. So the old, we'll just let it pass mentality is just not going to be acceptable and probably won't survive, in the new norm that we're about to move into. So what would you do? If we knew out of the story from Chicago that we had less than 3% of our customers giving us 80% of our profit, you're going to look at those customers in a very different way. Those customers may be able to say, look, they are buying some of the tariff-related product, but they're buying a lot of other product. We have a lot of margin here to work with. We don't want to damage that relationship at all. We're absolutely going to do nothing. We're just going to stay the course with these customers. Or you may say, well, there is going to be an impact. It is going to reduce the margin to a degree. Maybe we can get them to buy a little more. Or, well, the tariff is going to have enough of an impact. We have to smartly look at which products we want to change the price and discounts for in order to be able to offset that a little bit. But being very careful, with white gloves, to being able to be sure that you're maintaining the relationships with these very vital customers. Now, that's not the same as what you would want to do with the unprofitable customers. With unprofitable customers, and you've got tariff increases, you're obviously going to be even more negative. So you've got to do something. And one of the things you could do is say, all right, we're going to go in with a different targeted price and discount strategy. And we're going to try to get them to not be a negative performing customer, if you will. Or it may be that's just not possible. And so what you move into is ending that relationship because they are a drain to your financials. And there's just no reason, unless there's some market advantage, that you would want to maintain that relationship. So again, diversifying the strategies associated with having information around customers and products is vital when thinking about creating reactive analytics that give you the ability to thrive in a supply chain disruption. But what happens if you don't know that the disruption is coming, like the tariffs that we just discussed, but it is some form of a disruption that's going to dramatically impact your operation? What do? Well, we're going to start with the same thing, looking at customers, and we're going to be able to understand which customers matter the most or where it would hurt the most. And then we're going to couple that with products. So thinking about what products that we're selling to be able to maximize our profit margins and what products are not at all doing very well. And it's the combination of those two aspects of visualization of information that then allow you to start targeting very specific strategies associated with what to do. The first thing, as we talked about in the last slide, is you're probably going to want to look at those 36 customers. This is a different customer base, but those 35 customers, they're costing you a little over $7 million, and you're losing just under $2 million on them. So if you have limited resources, say there's a product shortage or there's some capacity issue associated with your operation due to the disruption, clearly this is one immediate area to look at to be able to minimize financial impact. But what else can you do? Well, you can look at the products and customer combinations that are giving you the vast majority of your profit contributions and create very specific strategies. 201 customers, 403 products, 68% of the total profit. And if I'm going to put my energy, I only have so many resources that I can use to address this disruption. I'm going to focus there first. And then I'm going to look at the rest of the products that my really great customers are buying, but I'm going to start with protecting the things that would actually hurt the most. Here's a great Atlanta story. This is the Home Depot. Mark Holyfield is head of the supply chain for Home Depot. And they saw and anticipated the impact on tariffs and did exactly that. So they looked at every SKU that was going to be impacted by a tariff. They looked at the suppliers. They looked at third parties that were involved with it. And they created mitigation strategies to address that in order to have the minimal impact on the operation for their stores. And this article and one other we'll reference in just a moment, we can make available to you if you would like to actually read the full article. But a great story about being able to think about proactively handling tariffs. All right, if we've handled reactive, how do we approach proactive? What can we do in order to add resiliency to our supply chain as it relates to an event that hasn't even occurred? So let's think about that for a little bit. So again, we're getting into a situation where we're looking where we are vulnerable. We're thinking about creating mitigation plans that reduce the actual risk of the operation. And we're doing it in a way that we're being very focused on the things that really would matter the very most. So this is proactive strategies. No event has occurred, but we're looking to see where we could, in fact, have a serious disruption. Let's focus on that. So now we're going to go from the customer side to the actual supplier side. Now, these are 73 suppliers. that are being used for finished goods in a company. So they have other manufacturing sites, their own manufacturing. They really wanted to look at their suppliers that were offering these finished goods and to see, is there any possibility that we might be very vulnerable with regard to a disruption associated with this supply base. These suppliers created just under $18 million in profit. And the question was, should we prioritize who to look at? I don't know if you've had an opportunity, but CSCMT worked with the University of Tennessee and one other group, and they did a very good research project, which is ongoing, to be able to look at the actual risk of doing business in particular countries. So 64 countries. And what they did is they said, let's do this based on 4 dimensions. Let's look at the economic aspect of that country. How strong is the economy? Let's look at the political stability of that country. Let's think about the infrastructure and can it support, a dramatic increase in manufacturing? And is there competency, business competency associated with that region, so we can have resources, hire people, etc. So they created this index from 0 to 5 for each of these countries to identify areas that one should be concerned with if you're doing business in them. And then we take that and we apply that to those 73 suppliers. So now we have our suppliers, as you can see on a map, that are sized by the amount of profit that they generate for us, and they're color-coded based on the EPIC index. And as we can all see, there's a big orange one right over in the China area. And that would be something you'd want to be concerned with. So if you set an index, let's just say from 0 to 5, you said, I want to look at every supplier that's under 2.25, which would mean, it's definitely in the lower range of where you want to be. And so you want to say, let's just look at those suppliers to help narrow this down because we can't look at all of them. And what we would find is we have 17 suppliers, and that it represents just under $8 million in profit. And they are the ones that we would want to start looking at. But you might say, well, that's still a lot. 17 suppliers is a lot of suppliers to be able to do a detailed evaluation of what we want to do, whether we want to do dual sourcing or some other mitigation strategy. So how can we narrow that down even more? Well, what one could do is you could go and look at the actual indexes associated with EPIC. So you see the horizontal bar there is at that 2.25. So you might want to lower that or raise that depending on what you're trying to do. And then you could actually set a index associated with profitability. So I want to look at really profitable products coming from these suppliers, or I'd like to look at ones that are just marginally, but they're still very important to me. But you have the ability to change this to create a zone of interest, if you will. So obviously, the labeled zone A, which is the bottom right corner, are products that are contributing an important amount of profit, but are below the EPIC index that I selected. These are the ones I want to start with. And so when I do that, I might go from the number we have here to maybe 6 to 8 suppliers. And then I would want to look at those suppliers. I'd want to look at how much volume I'm getting from them, profit I'm getting from them, and then maybe go to a supplier scorecard to be able to identify key characteristics of that supplier in order to define if I'm going to mitigate that risk in some way. So the whole goal of this is to use that precise information on profit and cost and be able to look at areas that are not, hundreds and hundreds of suppliers, but being able to focus on 10 suppliers and be able to know that I've made a conscious decision as to what I'm going to do. And if I have done something, I have added resiliency associated with my supply. This is a great story. Williams-Sonoma, again, being very proactive. They had 1/5 of their product coming from China. And they knew that that was going to be an issue. So they started very early in the process to think about mitigation strategies that would allow them to be more resilient. And again, we can make this article available to you. So they went in and looked at different strategies, again, depending on the segmentation of customers, of stores and products that they were actually selling. So they looked at increasing prices in some cases, reducing costs, renegotiating suppliers, bringing some of the manufacturing back into the U.S., and fast forwarding the inventory that many companies did ahead of the tariff increases. So all strategies that were based on segmented groupings of products and the stores that were actually selling them. So what happened was very interesting, that they actually significantly reduced the volume that was coming out of China. And look at what happened. Their margins actually increased. So they were so proactive, they were able to get a great financial advantage out of thinking about those risks, being proactive, applying the right strategies, and actually increasing the ability to make money. So hopefully that's helpful to you with regard to the actual utilization of some of the work that we're talking through today. So what is our conclusion? COVID-19 and tariffs are going to set a new operating norm, as I mentioned before. We strongly believe that companies are going to be required to demonstrate what they are doing on a proactive basis and an ongoing basis in order to add resiliency to their supply chain. Shareholders will not tolerate having disruptions that are actually just not, there's been nothing to address them in advance or during that is adding resiliency. So we believe this is something that is going to be a required ongoing part of S&OP processes or other operational strategic planning processes in order to demonstrate that resiliency. So the takeaways are this. The prior COVID-19 general operating strategies associated with supply chain risk are no longer going to work. And as we saw from that DHL survey, for some companies, the strategy was no strategy. That's just not going to be acceptable. It's going to be critical to understand the exact profit contribution of every product and customer, to use that to create differentiated strategies that are based on segmentation of customers and products. And that it can be around service levels, defining different service levels we talked about for the company in Chicago, what products you're offering, how you're handling pricing and discounts. All of that are levers that you can use in order to navigate through a disruption or to add resiliency to your operation prior to a disruption. Key suppliers can be identified and be able to be selected as to what mitigation strategies you want to use to be able to keep your supply base strong. And operating networks can be reconfigured to take out unnecessary costs, such as I'm treating all customers with the same level of service. Now that I see how important these are versus other customers, I change service levels in a smart way based on their financial contributions. Or maybe working capital, reducing inventory that is not necessary, or being able to focus on things that are allowing you to use that money in smarter ways. So the bottom line is that best practices in supply chain risk management have two very important parts. There's the reactive part, which is associated with being as agile as possible when an event occurs, to be able to minimize the financial impact of that event on your operation. Being proactive to be able to look at where you need to add resiliency in order to make your supply chain stronger and have a less impact if a disruption actually occurs. But as we said from Frank Zappa, it all comes back to one size does not fit all as you're thinking about your supply chain risk mitigation strategies.